This next section is about the sort of culture and society of the 1920s, and it's amid the rather conservative political climate that we discussed earlier that you see sort of huge changes in society and culture happening. As we talked about in class, that during the 1920 census, it became revealed, or rather, it was revealed that the urban population in the U.S. is now surpassing the rural population. However, we also discussed that there is some problem with this idea in that urban was defined as 2,500 people or more as far as community size went. So there's still some question as to whether the society was truly urban. However, this movement towards urbanization affects different groups in different ways. For example, you see in the 1920s huge migration of African Americans from the rural South to the much more urban North. For many women, city life meant easier housework, thanks to sort of labor-saving devices and appliances. As far as social impact, you have the huge, huge effect of the automobile. This proved to have some sort of mixed benefits. You got ease of movement, some sense of freedom, and various other things like that, but you also got traffic jams and parking problems and highway fatalities. More than 26,000 people in 1924 died in highway accidents. In some cases, the automobile brought families together. People went on family vacations to national parks, which are a new thing, and things like that. You see industries benefiting, roadside restaurants and attractions and motels all benefiting from this. But in some ways, you also see the erosion of the family unit, as well as parental authority. Young people can now just borrow the car and go out and catch a movie or go to a dance or otherwise get up to mischief. Middle and upper class women welcomed the automobile. They were able to sort of personally gain a sense of independence. They could go to work now, or they could attend meetings, or they could go visit friends. Stereotypes of feminine delicacy began to fade as women were able to very quickly master driving vehicles. Automobiles also offered families much easier access to neighborhoods than they previously had, and so you see a huge migration, especially of upper and middle class city residents out. They're moving out of the cities and towards the suburbs. And so we see a kind of shift in the urban landscape. The urban landscape becomes much more impoverished as it's those people who are less able to move out of the city who populate it. And you have your upper and middle class citizens moving out to the suburbs. And so you see cities expanding as well. You're starting to get to where you could no longer walk to the grocery store or walk to the bank and get your things done. It's all moving out and becoming more suburban, and that trend increases as we go through time as well. Automobiles also offered farm families a lot easier access to neighbors and to the city than they had previously, so it's kind of lessened their rural isolation in a way. Adverts would celebrate the freedom that automobiles offered, in contrast to the sort of fixed routes and schedules that you would get with railroad or street cars. So you see a decline in public transportation as well. You also have a sort of further standardization of American life. Buses were able to carry children to consolidated schools, so you don't have to have as many schools in places. You can have one big sort of central school. And buses would carry the children to that school from relatively long distances. Things like neighborhood grocery stores and banks and things like that, as I've also discussed, begin to disappear. The first suburban shopping center came with the introduction of the automobile, and the first fast food chain came with the introduction of the automobile, which, if anyone's interested, was the A&W Root Beer restaurant. Automobiles remained far too expensive for a lot of Americans, even at prices like $300 or $400, and even with sort of financing options available. And so you get, as I said before, the rise of automobile suburbs, which attract the sort of well-to-do middle and upper class citizens. Along with urbanization, you also have electrification. All of this, plus the rise of automobiles, has a massive impact on America's natural resources and the environment. Plants consumed growing quantities of coal in order to generate the electricity needed for our electrified society. Refineries are using more than 1 billion barrels of petroleum in order to meet gasoline demands. Rising gasoline consumption underlies Washington's efforts to ensure U.S. access to Mexican oil, and also triggers feverish competition in oil fields in states like Texas and Oklahoma. The wilderness that had inspired a lot of 19th century artists, sort of romantic artists and writers, became much more accessible as cars and improved roads gave greater access to these places, to national parks, and various regions like that. And while this development sort of broadened the constituency for those who wanted to preserve the wilderness, it also subjected the parks to very heavy pressures from vacationers who wanted to have service stations and restaurants and hotels and other amenities. And so while they were able to visit them and see the wonder of the wilderness and encourage that desire to preserve it, you also have the desire for modern conveniences. And so in a way, they also encouraged the decimation of that pristine wilderness. Prosperity and workplace drudgery also stimulated leisure activities in the 1920s, and mass-produced entertainment sort of became the way of things. Mass circulation magazines proliferated, things like Reader's Digest sort of hits it big in the 1920s. Book publishers also expand their market by selling through department stores or directly to the public through like Book of the Month type clubs where you could get a book mailed to you every month. While some criticized these ventures as sort of debasing literature, they did help sustain and in a way create a modern national culture in what was becoming an increasingly diverse society. Radio and the movies also offered this kind of standardized cultural fare. The radio era began in 1920 when Pittsburgh station KDKA reported on Warren Harding's election. In 1922, New York station began a regular news program and even broadcast the World Series. And after that, hundreds of new stations began popping up. In 1926, you have 3 companies, General Electric, Westinghouse, and Radio Corporation of America, combined to form the first really big radio network, and it was the National Broadcast Company, or NBC. The Columbia Broadcast Company, which was CBS, followed soon after that, and with the invention, or with the introduction of these national companies, which operate multiple radio stations, you have Americans all across the country listening to the same jokes, hearing the same news, absorbing the same commercials, and it has a standardizing effect on American culture. Some public policy commentators advocated preserving radio as an educational or cultural medium without advertising or anything like that, but commercial sponsorship soon won out, and we end up with the radio like we have today, where it's 10 minutes of songs and 20 minutes of commercials. The movies also sort of made cultural steps forward. They were sort of lowbrow entertainment, being shown in the Nickelodeons of the immigrant neighborhoods and things like that. Well, they now migrate to sort of upper class, elegant pleasure palaces, where all social classes were happy to attend. Los Angeles and Hollywood replaced New York as the nation's sort of film capital. Despite the charges of immorality movies often serve to reinforce a lot of conservative values. For example, the Ten Commandments came out in 1923 and cautioned against sort of breaking moral taboos through the portrayal of this epic biblical story. America's Sweetheart, Mary Pickford, sported a look quite often of sort of frail vulnerability, and she played a lot of innocent girls in need of protection, which served to reinforce traditional gender stereotypes, especially when confronted with the ideas of the new woman who wore short skirts and smoked cigarettes and, had a job and drove cars and things like that. And so she operated as a kind of reinforcement of old norms and old fashions. Although she did occasionally play characters who could hold their own to some extent. Technical innovations also kept moviegoers coming. The Jazz Singer in 1927 introduced sound. Walt Disney's cartoon Steamboat Willie in 1928 introduced Mickey Mouse, but also introduced the medium of animation as a potential for interesting film. Like advertising, the movies also created a dream world that was only rather loosely tethered to reality. These kind of mass-produced fantasies shaped behavior and values, especially for young people who were probably the most apt to consume them. Along with other things like department stores and mass magazines, movies also stimulated consumption with images of the good life and presenting new sort of vistas of consumer abundance. The 1920s mass culture was also a byproduct of urbanization. The new mass culture penetrated society somewhat unevenly. It had less impact in places that remained relatively rural and met a lot of resistance among evangelical Christians, sort of fundamentalists, which we'll talk about later. Mexican Americans also sought to preserve their traditional culture through festivities and leisure activities, despite Americanization efforts. Working class African Americans flocked to concerts of performers outside of the mass media mainstream, and you see a artistic movement amongst Black America as well, which we'll talk about again later. Along with network radio and network shows and broadcast farm reports and things like that, local stations would broadcast local news, local church services, community announcements, and other things like that. So despite the trend towards standardization of culture, you still see some diversity being preserved as a result of this. Professional sports and media also promoted spectacles that provided diversion as well, in addition to things like radio and films. Celebrities dominated professional sports. People like Babe Ruth, who played for the New York Yankees, Ty Cobb, who played for the Detroit Tigers, and eventually became their manager, actually, and prize fighters like Jack Dempsey or Gene Tunney, all provided some sort of celebrity culture, which came as a kind of advent in the 1920s. The alchemy of publicity transformed them into heroes with contrived nicknames. So Ruth was known as the Sultan of SWAT, or Cobb was known as the Georgia Peach. This celebrity culture illuminates the stresses that were facing ordinary Americans in these years of change. For young women, uncertainty about shifting expectations in society. Beauty pageants offered an ideal, a sort of single ideal to which they could aspire. The exploits of sports heroes like Dempsey or Ruth could also restore damaged self-esteem for a lot of men who were confronted with unsettling developments from things like feminism to sort of workplace regulations and bosses who watched your every move. Celebrity worship also crested in response to Charles Lindbergh, who we see pictured here. He was a stunt pilot and made the first solo flight across the Atlantic in his single small engine plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, which is behind him in the picture. He became something of an instant celebrity following his New York to Paris flight, and kind of served as a sort of blank slate for people to project their own hopes and fears and ideologies. He was sort of your all-American young man. He was good looking, he was virtuous to a point, or at least as far as Americans knew, he was virtuous, and sort of the kind of guy that you would bring home and meet your parents, sort of thing. And he sort of lived on in people's imaginations like that. But new mass media also had sort of mixed social effects. This kind of cultural standardization also promoted a certain amount of uniformity of thought. But it also helped to forge a national culture and perhaps introduce new viewpoints and new ways of behaving that weren't previously considered. And so it's a bit of a mixed bag. As with most innovations or most introductions of new things, you get a bit of a mixed bag of positives and negatives, and this is no different, really. The war's disillusioned aftermath also very harshly sharpened the sort of cultural restlessness that you see beginning in pre-war America, but it really comes to fruition in the 1920s, and you can see that in the sort of cultural changes that go on in the 1920s. Post-war cultural sort of ferment was summed up with the phrase the Jazz Age, which took a lot of different forms, and it meant different things. Some young people, especially college students, attacked old-style middle-class values and standards of behavior. They grabbed onto the freedom that was offered by the automobiles. They threw parties. They drank bootleg liquor. They flocked to jazz clubs as their sort of prime means of entertainment. They also were urged on in this behavior by advertisers, many of them who sort of encouraged young women to defy sort of prevailing ideas and standards by taking up cigarettes. And for some, things like smoking even became a feminist issue. Young people also were much more open in their discussions of sex and sexuality. Sigmund Freud, who was a Viennese physician, explored various sexual aspects of human psychology and was very popular in the 1920s. The sexual revolution of the 20s, however, is somewhat hard to pin down. Premarital sex remains still something of an exceptional and widely disapproved of activity, and especially for women. But what we can document with regards to the sexual revolution of the 20s is patterns of courtship and how they change in the 1920s become something much more recognizable to us today. Prior to that, couples would court, which usually involved young men coming to the houses of young ladies. They would sit and they would have conversation, they would have dinner, they would take tea with the parents of that young woman, and they very rarely got any time alone with each other. But by the 1920s, you have the much more casual practice of dating, where if the young man came to the house, it was only to take the young woman and they would go out and do something, which involved much less parental supervision and much more freedom and the idea of who they chose as a partner or how they chose them. The 1920s saw greater erotic freedom within certain bounds. Most young people drew a very clear line between what was permissible and what remained taboo. And so in that way, the 1920s was particularly revolutionary. For women, these changes proved liberating in some ways. Female sexuality is much more openly acknowledged. women had shorter skirts, they wore more makeup, and things like that. And figures became much more sort of boyish. The ideal figure for a girl in the 1920s became much more boyish, and kind of moved away from the traditional or the traditionally idolized hourglass, an extreme hourglass, which was very popular in the Victorian era just previously. The enduring stereotype of the sort of 1920s woman is the flapper image, with her sort of bobbed hair, cigarette, lipstick, short skirt, all of that, more or less a journalistic creation, and pretty much epitomized youthful rejection of former entrenched stereotypes. It was an ideal more than anything else. In some ways, though, the mass culture of the 20s actually thwarted full gender equality. While some older taboos were rejected, you now have new ones taking their places. So, for example, women's appearances and ideal figures and ideal fashions are now dictated by fashion magazines. Advertisers and movies encourage women to pursue glamorous lifestyles, which included purchasing new fashions and cosmetics and silk stockings and other things. The traditional double standard, which held women to a higher moral code of behavior, also remained in force throughout the 1920s. F. Scott Fitzgerald describes the Jazz Age as adults embracing the rebelliousness of the young, but this kind of generalization can be somewhat misleading. During the years of Fitzgerald's sort of national orgy, as he alleges, the divorce rate remained more or less constant. A lot of conservative and religious Americans were clinging to their traditional standards. You have the rejection of things like alcohol and wild parties coming from these sectors. You have the revival of fundamentalism, and all these sorts of things that are coming about, which kind of tempers this idea of just general rebelliousness. The Jazz Age was at least partially a media creation and also at least partially a literary creation. Fitzgerald's first novel, his first big hit, This Side of Paradise, spawned a lot of imitators, and it was all about this idea of youthful rebellion. Fitzgerald is probably one of the more kind of typical representations of this sort of Jazz Age idea. He and his wife were very interesting characters, kind of larger than life, and they lived a larger than life existence as well, sort of gallivanting between New York and Paris, and various other glamorous locations. But the stereotypical sort of Jazz Age idea tends to obscure the complexity of the age itself. Apologies for the phone there. Like I was saying, the Jazz Age stereotype does capture a part of the post-war scene, especially the sort of new mass culture, the sort of hedonism, materialism, consumerism, all those kind of isms of the well-to-do. But it masks another part of it, which sort of adds to the complexity of the age. The 1920s are not sort of what you would see on the surface. They are much more than what we would like to think. Like F. Scott Fitzgerald, a lot of young writers found the decade's cultural turbulence to be energizing for their particular art. Rejecting the sort of older moralistic pieties, they also tended to dislike business pieties of the new order, so they were very much not enthralled by the new business-orientated, consumer-orientated culture, political culture that seemed to pervade the United States. And you have a lot of satirical writers who speak to this. One novelist, Sinclair Lewis, writes a lot about the sort of smugness and cultural barrenness of fictional Midwestern towns. He also attacks the larger city, the middle class, the business class, and various problems that he sees in the decade. H.L. Mencken was also a satirical writer. He's a journalist and a critic, and in 1924 launched the iconoclastic American Mercury magazine, which was an instant success with the various alienated intellectuals and college youth. They ridiculed everything from politicians to small-town America to fundamentalism to the middle class. He wrote essays specifically concerning President Harding and Coolidge, and an essay about William Jennings Bryan after the court case, the Scopes case, as well. For the novelist Ernest Hemingway, who saw his most successful period in the 1920s, World War I was something of a watershed experience for him, and a lot of his work deals with his kind of loss of idealism following the horrors of the war. He served in the war himself, and so a lot of his novels in this period have a lot to do with that experience for him. Although writers like Hemingway and like Lewis tended to sort of blast the wartime hypocrisy and the post-war vulgarity, they remained American at heart. While Hemingway actually spent most of his writing career not in America, he was in Europe for the most part. But you still have this sort of yearning to create a more authentic American national culture. Even Fitzgerald, to some point, to some extent, who was completely caught up in the whole Jazz Age sort of excesses, was fundamentally a moralist, as we can see through his work in The Great Gatsby, which is basically a criticism of the superficiality, selfishness, and disregard for the less fortunate that you see among sort of the upper middle class, which are the main characters of his book. Beyond the literary world, you also have new creativity in art and architecture and music. The burst of architectural creativity transforms the urban skyline in the 1920s. By 1930, New York had boasted 4 buildings that were more than 50 stories tall, and they had begun work on the 102-story Empire State Building. The decade's leading painters took America, either real or imagined, as their subject, and some of the paintings we looked at as well sort of portray this. A lot of them deal with urban scenes because of this sort of shift to an urban society in America. The decade's creative ferment also inspired composers, and so you have music particularly sort of definitive of the 20s. Of all the musical innovations, though, jazz is probably the one that best captured the kind of modernist spirit. The original Dixieland Jazz Band was white musicians imitating the New Orleans black jazz style of music. It debuted in New York City in 1917 and kind of launched a vogue that spread through live performances, through radio, through recordings, and jazz became the kind of popular music of the age. Meanwhile, while white musicians are embracing this sort of fundamentally African-American style of music, black musicians are also trying to preserve their authentic jazz and exploring its potential as well. And so you have a lot of famous jazz musicians, black jazz musicians like Louis Armstrong, coming to the fore as well. Although much of the 1920s sort of popular culture fades very quickly, jazz is one of the more enduring qualities of that particular age. The last thing that we'll talk about also has to do with African American culture and a sort of revival of African American culture, and it was known as the Harlem Renaissance. The kind of social upheavals of the decade of the 20s energized African American cultural life, especially in New York City, and the main sort of urban neighborhood for African Americans in New York was Harlem. And so it became the center of this movement. This area attracted a lot of African Americans during the First World War, and by 1930, most of New York City's black population lived in Harlem. This concentration, plus its proximity to things like Broadway theaters, recording companies, book publishers, all contributed to this movement, this artistic movement, the Harlem Renaissance. It took on various different forms, from composers who produced various works, to painters and sculptors. Broadway shows. One particular hit in 1921 was Shuffle Along, and launched a series of popular all-black actor musicals. Poet Langston Hughes incorporated African themes and Southern black traditions in his compositions that sort of describe his view of America as it stood in the 1920s. You have philosophy professor Alan Locke at Howard University assembling a series of essays and poems and short stories, all documenting the cultural richness of the area of Harlem itself. As all this is happening, the white cultural establishment is also taking notice of it. Book publishers and magazine editors are courting black writers. The 1929 Hollywood film Hallelujah featured an all-black cast, although it kind of romanticized plantation life and dramatized the dangers of the city. So, in effect, it was a kind of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back sort of a thing. And that, yes, you have an all-black cast, but the subject matter is probably questionable. The Renaissance itself resonated internationally. Jazz won fans all over the world, in Europe, Africa, Latin America, and Australia. With white support also came a certain amount of misunderstanding and a certain amount of attempts to control the movement itself. Rebellious young people tended to romanticize the Harlem nightlife. They ignored any of the social problems that were inherent in the community itself. The exuberance of the Renaissance movement faded as we move into the 1930s and as the Depression grips and hard times return again. However, future black writers, artists, musicians, performers, all of these owe a great deal to the success of this movement in the 1920s. Also, with this movement and with the concentration of people in neighborhoods like Harlem, you get a heightened sense of political consciousness as well. And this sharpened awareness is also involved in tensions between whether the community should become integrated with the rest of American society or whether it should actively separate itself as well. And so you have that kind of conflict adding to the complexity of the decade that is the 1920s. I just have a few images I wanted to share with you. The large image on your left is a cover of Life magazine, which kind of shows that sort of stereotypical jazz age idea. You have sort of raucous musicians, you have a flapper girl portrayed with her short skirt and her short hair, dancing exuberantly, I suppose, to what is undoubtedly the sounds of jazz music. In the top right, there's a nice cartoon here talking about the sort of moral crisis or crisis of values, which we discussed earlier as well. And there you can see a woman in a sort of traditional Victorian kind of bathing costume. And she's looking at the sort of 1920s girl over there in her rather short bathing suit, and she's talking about how the views at this particular beach are quite vulgar, and she's going to have to leave. And so you get a sense of the sort of animosity of the older set to this newer idea. And then at the bottom you have an image there of Langston Hughes, who, as we discussed before, was one of the sort of prominent figures of the Harlem Renaissance movement.